hello everyone, it again. So Tashina, if you could quickly pull up the slides, please.
Yes.
So this is a work done as part of a policy think tank, which is based out of Southern India in Bangalore. We are called the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy. We are a not-for-profit organization, and we started our journey in 2005. And of course, we've taken different avatars. The various areas of work that we've been involved in has changed over time. And right now, we have these various different verticals that we are involved in: energy and power, climate, environment, and sustainability, air pollution, also AI and digital platforms, and strategic studies. So we work across the various different states of India. Our vision and mission is to enrich policy making with innovative approaches using science and technology for a sustainable, secure, and inclusive society. So those verticals or the sectors that I showed you earlier, basically, we are all working towards addressing what we call as these grand challenges. One is definitely clean energy transition. This piece of work, obviously, the energy and power sector does deal with it. And to an extent, even the climate team deals with this, because we are looking at climate mitigation. And of course, clean air for all, again, the decarbonization pathway scenarios all look at clean air for all. And then, of course, the air pollution team delves into this. Sustainable and secure future, again, cuts across many verticals that operate within Cstep. And of course, at the heart of all of this is what we call as digital transformation. Although it is a vertical, but in many ways, it's more horizontal, because it cuts across all the various different sectors and all the pieces of work that we do together. Now, the work that Tashina is going to be presenting has been done as part of the climate, environment, and sustainability sector, which I head. I'm Indu Murthy. And so we look at, obviously, different aspects of sustainable development. We look at mitigation and adaptation in silos, but also we try to look at, not exactly try, we do in our work very consciously are looking at trade-offs and synergies and co-benefits whenever any of these aspects are delved into in the work that we do. Now, I request my colleague, Tashina, who is going to be talking about this work done by the adaptation and risk analysis vertical, where we've looked at the climate co-benefits of developmental programs. One very large developmental program that's implemented in India, which she will be talking into. So just a quick introduction to Tashina. Tashina has been working in this particular space of climate development, natural resource sectors for about about 15 years, close to 15 years already. And this particular program that she's going to be delving into is something that she spent a lot of years actually looking into. In fact, she was part of a research which did its first assessment, although it was an employment guarantee program, the environmental benefits of this, the vulnerability reduction potential. So some of the cutting edge work, the pioneering work that happened was led by Tashina, and she's been continuing to kind of be in and out of this piece of work, because it's quite vast, quite huge, and there are various dimensions of this program that need to be looked at. So over to you, Tashina, to throw light on the climate co-benefits of the specific program, and also by and large, how this framework could actually be applied for various different developmental programs. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Indu, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. Good evening from Bangalore, India. So yeah, we'll just jump straight into the topic, which is assessing climate co-benefits of development programs. I say development programs here, but it is based off of our research that was focused on one program or scheme that is implemented across India. It is called the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, or ACT. It is by far the world's largest safety net scheme, and in India, it is the largest poverty alleviation program. It legally offers people from rural areas, any adult member of a household, 100 days of work if they demand it. And they provide work to rural households by creating community assets that are essentially aimed at rejuvenating the natural resource base across India, across rural India, which most of rural India's economy is dependent on. Now, the works implemented under MGNREGS vary from natural resource management works to non-NRM based community development works. There are over 260 interventions that are implemented across the scheme. And for example, natural resource management works here could be desilting community local water bodies, plantation of trees on wastelands. They could also be private works, so people taking up construction of farm ponds on their private farmlands, also horticulture plantations on private farmlands. Whereas the non-natural resource management works could be construction of a community building, or say, for example, if a village requires a cemetery or road connectivity is something that the scheme takes up quite heavily as well to provision employment to rural households. Just to give you a little bit more context here, as Indu said, we've been working on this scheme for quite some time now, and it has kind of attracted a lot of attention from policymakers because evidence has been generated over the past decade that shows that MGNREGS, or the scheme that I'm talking about, has the potential to help households adapt to climate hazards, as well as sequester carbon dioxide through plantation work specifically. And these additional benefits of this scheme is what we here term as climate co-benefits, because the objective of the scheme is not to generate these, but to just provision employment to rural households while creating assets for the community. However, many of these studies are case study based, in the sense that they're piecemeal work that have been scattered across the country. They would either focus on resilience, to some extent on adaptation, and very few have actually focused on mitigation. However, the government of India has recognized this potential, and in the master circular itself, they have acknowledged that the scheme is one of the key initiatives to address climate change. Furthermore, they have also identified that MGNREGS has the potential to help us meet our sustainable development goals, particularly when it comes to asset creation, social and women empowerment. And they, to some extent, through these case study-based assessments, have highlighted its potential to kind of contribute towards climate action, but they are not really measuring to what extent the scheme has the potential to actually provision climate action-based results, right? All of you are aware of what these terminologies are, but just to reiterate, because we're going to be getting into a discussion on climate co-benefits, and so it is important to understand what we mean by them. So just to reiterate some of these definitions, resilience essentially is the capacity of any system, they can either be social, economic, or environmental, to respond or cope with a climate hazardous event in a way that its essential function is maintained. Whereas adaptation is a conscious adjustment of that system to actual or expected climate impacts. So in such a way that you're reducing the level of impact that you could potentially have if a climate hazard were to occur. Whereas mitigation here is any kind of human intervention that reduces emissions or enhances the sink of greenhouse gases. And what I mean by that is essentially removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in some way. So getting into what climate co-benefits are, here essentially climate co-benefits refer to either local or global benefits of any development policy or program that contributes to resilience, adaptation, and mitigation of climate change. These are essentially unintended positive side effects of development. Initially, the term co-benefits was used to sell climate actions, whereas you would try to convince public that taking up this climate action would also result in clean air, better human health. And so these were co-benefits of climate policies. And here we're flipping that switch and saying your development actions can also have climate benefits, where you're helping communities adapt or build their resilience or even mitigate carbon for that matter. And just to give you a quick example of that, horticulture plantations, if we look at them, their main purpose essentially is to help a farmer get maybe fruit, which will then help that farmer get some income. And if the farmer also has, say, agriculture-based production, then it's diversifying that livelihood and to some extent provide food security. Now, diversification of livelihood, we know that it helps to cope with climate hazards. And here I've just given an example of a drought. This essentially means that to some extent you have an additional source of income that is not as climate sensitive as, say, agriculture or production of field crops. And so you can tide over any impacts of a hazard. Horticulture trees also help protect soil and they enrich soil. To some extent, they lower surface runoff. So they're slowing down rainfall runoff. And by doing so, they recharge groundwater. They also sequester carbon. So besides just provisioning fruit, they are also able to help this farmer cope with droughts, build resilience by protecting soil and groundwater recharge, and also mitigate carbon. This is just one of the examples, and horticulture plantations is actually a work that is taken up under MGNREGS scheme. Now, moving on to why we took up this study. So, like Indu had mentioned earlier, we have been working on this program for over a decade now, and we have quite nuanced understanding of what is happening on the ground. And so we wanted to develop a comprehensive framework that would help us quantify these benefits, be it building resilience, helping households adapt, or even mitigating carbon, these benefits of MGNREGS works. Furthermore, we wanted to find a way to mainstream this framework to quantify and report these climate co-benefits at the national level, because MGNREGS is implemented pan-India, and that is a massive scale. Why do it? Exactly why I just said, because it is implemented pan-India. And furthermore, it would help India actually with reporting their international reporting requirements. For example, the UN SDGs, the NDCs, as well as the adaptation communications, which we will have to submit to the UNFCCC from 2024. So how we went about doing this was we were approached by CSOs or organizations, NGOs that work in a state of West Bengal, where they are essentially implementing a huge river rejuvenation program called Ushar Mukti, which literally translates to freedom from drought. And they were doing so through MGNREGS. So MGNREGS was operationalizing this program, and it is massive. They've already benefited over 187,000 households. They've raised 30,000 hectares of plantations with almost 1.5 crore trees. They've treated over 90,000 hectares with water conservation and harvesting structures, creating a huge water potential. Now, these organizations that work at the grassroots kind of approach Cstep saying, we understand that the plantation of trees has the potential to sequester carbon. And so if you could come and help us quantify that, that would be great. And instead of leaving it at that, because we understand the potential of these works to also helping communities build resilience and help them adapt to hazards, we were like, please also focus on these co-benefits. And so we went about quantifying all 3 co-benefits for this program. And it helped us prove a concept and also develop a conceptual framework, which we are yet to test for MGNREGS at this state, but it helped us develop that framework for quantification of co-benefits from this massive development program. So we went into this project with this conceptual framework in place. And we'd have to do this because it is, like I said, a huge project. The scale of it is quite enormous. Just to give you an idea of how enormous it is, it essentially covers about 2,000 watersheds, which is an area of over 1.5, almost about 1.5 million hectares, right? And they have about 332,100,000 activities implemented across this program. And so in order to actually go about quantifying co-benefits from this program, we had to develop firstly a sampling protocol because it was a rapid-based assessment. We had to do it within a certain period of time. And so we had to develop a sample. And how we went about doing that was using this sampling protocol, where we looked at the total number of works, then filtered it down to the number of GPs or Gram Panchayats, which are the smallest administrative unit in India. Within project intensive blocks. And by that, I essentially mean that the program was implemented in some blocks more intensively as compared to others. They were trying to saturate these blocks with works to see compounding effects of these works. And because they were doing it at a watershed scale, so they were treating individual watersheds and they wanted to see compounding impacts of these interventions. And so they had project intensive, activity intensive blocks. And so we narrowed it down. We randomly selected 15% of the Gram Panchayats, which had about 147 watersheds. And then we randomly selected those watersheds that had more than 20 works. Finally, we got about 13 watersheds that were randomly selected for this assessment, which included about 541 works. And the works essentially included water harvesting structures, irrigation canals, rock checks, continuous contour trenches, land leveling, social forestry, horticulture, and vetiver plantations, including social forestry nurseries, which are essentially giving households small plants to raise so that they can sell them as an additional source of income. This is just essentially the distribution of the number of works. Because they were treating watersheds, they focused on construction of water harvesting structures across the watershed. Both public and private lands were covered for this. Social forestry was taken up on both public and private lands as well. Horticulture was taken up mostly on private lands, and irrigation canals were constructed under the project. These were the major works. The remaining works were very few in number, and we don't really see too much benefit coming from them. And the way we went about quantifying co-benefits from these works, for resilience and adaptation, we used household surveys and participatory rural appraisals. Household surveys were used for individual assets. So those are assets that were constructed on individual lands, whereas assets that were taken up on public lands, we used participatory rural appraisals to gauge the benefit. Similarly, for mitigation co-benefits, we quantified them through actual field measurements. So we went to these fields, measured tree biomass, girth, height. We also collected soil samples to estimate soil carbon. Once we collected the data, we analyzed it at a watershed level, firstly, for household surveys and PRA. Similarly, for carbon stock for social forestry and horticulture plantations, we did the data analysis by considering the tree species, the year of plantation, as well as the area planted. This result from these sample watersheds were then generalized or extrapolated to the total number of works within project activity intensive blocks. Because these watersheds were selected first from project activity intensive blocks, they were generalized or extrapolated to those blocks. They were generalized essentially by considering, the percentage of households that were benefited or the area that was planted, and it depended mostly on the type of work under consideration. Once we generalized it to the PAIBs, we then again generalized it to the larger district, which housed these PAIBs. And so you get a larger picture for that project. Moving on to the results from our assessment, I really like this little graphic that we have on the right side. It kind of shows that every work has multiple co-benefits, especially because they are land and water-based works. We will focus mostly on horticulture and water harvesting structures because they were mostly implemented across the project areas. If we look at the situation before and after the project, you will see here, we started off with about 84 beneficiaries. That is our sample. Out of the 84 beneficiaries that we sampled, 36 cultivate their lands, right? 36 of them were cultivating their lands. Out of these 36, 33 shifted to horticulture plantations. That means they shifted from growing, say, paddy, or not paddy, but other field crops, to growing horticulture trees. 3 of them did not cultivate horticulture because they were not provided with saplings. So these are the households that were cultivating their lands. On the other side, we have households that were not cultivating their lands, and that is the majority here. That's 48 of these sampled households had fallow lands, and these are generationally fallow lands. That means that they've left these lands fallow for almost 30 to 35 years, untouched, unproductive, not growing anything. They're just lying barren. So out of the 48, 45 shifted to horticulture plantations. The program provided them with horticulture trees, so they were able to plant something on these lands. Whereas 3 of them were not provided saplings and so continued to leave their lands fallow. So out of the 78 that were provided with horticulture trees, 29 households did not have any trees surviving at the time of the assessment. 4 of them went back to cultivating lands, and about 25 of them went back to leaving their lands fallow. Whereas if you look at those households that had surviving trees, which is about 49 of them, you have 47 that are still waiting for their trees to mature, and 2 of them have now started harvesting fruit from their plantations. So when we conducted the assessment, it was only about 2 years into the project implementation, which means that only 2 years ago, and some of them would have been only a year ago, were provided with saplings for fruit trees. And so you cannot expect any kind of yields from these trees, because it will usually take 3 to 5 years for it to mature and start actually yielding any kind of fruit. Just jumping directly into the resilience and adaptation co-benefits from this plantations, most of the households with surviving trees reported a cooler ambient temperature and improved soil quality. Because these plantations were young, like I just said, there were no adaptation benefits reported here. And when I say adaptation benefits here, we're looking at an additional source of income, apart from their actual source of income, which could either be livestock rearing or cultivation, or even labor for that, right? Manual labor. Only in Purulia, which is a district in West Bengal, about 10% of the survey respondents stated that their mango plantations were yielding fruit, but even that was being used for subsistence. Additionally, about 5% of respondents are starting to collect dry leaves and branches from plantations to use as fuel wood. That is essentially an important thing to note here, is that plantation works here can be used for NTFP collection, that's non-timber forest produce, which help rural households meet some of their food, fuel needs. for which they might have to otherwise walk quite a distance. And so that kind of reduces their drudgery. Getting into water harvesting structures. Again, if we look at the before and after Ushar Mukti scenarios, we have about 217 households that were sampled, out of which 184 were cultivating their lands, and 33 again had generational fallow lands. Out of the 33 that had these fallow lands, most of them brought their lands, all of them brought their lands under cultivation, and most of them were irrigating their crops, whereas 5 of them were not using these structures for irrigation, but instead using them as recharge structures. Recharge structures in the sense that they would and also use them for duckery or fishery, right? And if we look at the households that were cultivating their lands, we see that about 67 of them already had irrigated agriculture. However, their irrigated agriculture, majority of them were only partially irrigating it, and 32 of them had seasonal irrigation, in the sense that they cannot irrigate their lands throughout the year. Maybe they can only irrigate their lands for 2 to 3 months in that year. So out of the seasonal irrigation households, we see that some of them were now reporting more than 1.5 months of water availability because they constructed that water harvesting structure. Similarly, for the households that had partial area coverage, we had households that reported that they're now able to irrigate more of their lands, a higher percentage of their lands. So we saw an expansion of area under irrigation. For the households that were rain-fed, which are the majority here who were cultivating the lands, 70 of them were able to bring their rain-fed agriculture under irrigation. But you can see that most of them were not really using their water harvesting structures for irrigation, but using them as recharge structures or using that water source for other livelihood opportunities, say drinking water for livestock or fisheries or ducking. Now, this kind of just reiterates what I just discussed about. We have farmers, about 60% of our farmers saying that they're able to now irrigate their lands. It has recharged groundwater and consequently increased the overall availability of water in the region. It increased the area under irrigation and provided access for an additional 1.5 months. It increased crop yields and farm incomes. They also serve as fish and duck ponds and also increase the availability of water for livestock. In terms of additional earnings, because they have now water for their livestock and they've introduced fisheries, farmers reported having almost 14,000 to 22,000 more per annum because of this water harvesting structure. In terms of adaptation, we see that it has helped farmers to protect their crops from dry spells and droughts, because now they have an access to a water source that buffers from any kind of delay in rainfall, which most farmers across India are rain-fed and depend on rainfall for their crop production. It has also helped them to diversify their incomes, and they're seeing higher household incomes because of these structures, and that higher income is helping them cope with hazards and losses because of drought. Social forestry is another work that is taken up under the scheme, under the program. Unfortunately, the average survival rate of these plantations was close to 70%, which is actually quite high for social forestry because they're on public lands, and management of public lands or the common goods, as you can imagine, is quite low. It increased, or respondents reported an increase in water quality of water harvesting structures downstream to these plantations. Like I'd explained earlier, trees have an ability to slow down runoff, and so there's less siltation in water harvesting structures downstream. They also have reported cooler temperatures as well as local fauna sightings. Plantations have also been perceived to improve soil quality within the regions where they have been planted. In terms of irrigation canals, the access to water has brought barren land under cultivation. It has improved crop productivity and thus farm incomes. And that has actually helped reduce migration in some of these villages, in which if they did not have this, they probably would have gone in search for manual labor elsewhere. And so that is quite an important social benefit. It provides a short supply of water to farmlands, which is essential to kind of cope with changing climates and changing weather patterns, especially rainfall. The next point essentially says that it provides drought protection to crops. It has also allowed farmers to diversify their cropping. So there has been an introduction of paddy and watermelon as new crops in these regions. In terms of mitigation, because the plantations were so young, we don't see very significant mitigation co-benefit, but the potential is there, and that is what we went about quantifying. We saw about 3,668 tons of carbon being sequestered as tree biomass, and another 5,700 tons being sequestered in soils of plantations across the program. What this essentially did for us is it gave us a proof of concept that we can quantify the co-benefits, the climate co-benefits of schemes like this. The framework for quantification of climate co-benefits from MGNREGS works that we have developed can be adopted by any state across India and mainstreamed by the central government. A stratified random sampling method can easily be used to select sample of works and beneficiaries to actually operationalize such a framework. But there are several prerequisites that we have identified that would be essential to establish such a framework, or even help states to adopt such a framework for quantification of their co-benefits from different development programs. Some of these prerequisites essentially are selections of indicators. We have found that it would be more relevant for states to select indicators that are in line with existing SDG and NDC targets, essentially because states are already in that frame of mind that they have a requirement from the center to quantify certain indicators that have already been developed. So identifying indicators that are along these lines will help them navigate that process. Furthermore, for each kind of co-benefit, a maximum of 2 to 3 indicators should be selected and quantified. The way we went about doing Ushar Mukti, we had a whole year to do it, and it was resource intensive. We had a massive questionnaire with a whole lot of questions, a 2-page questionnaire, and that helped us kind of quantify a whole lot of indicators for 1 or 2 aspects or 1 or 2 co-benefits. And that is not a feasible approach to kind of prescribe to a state. And so 2 to 3 key performance indicators would need to be selected. The second point is mapping of institutions and stakeholders. It is very important to identify who will be conducting these rapid field-based assessments, because not a lot of institutions have this capacity. There would be a need to develop a methods manual that has different methods for quantification of different climate co-benefits from different types of works. Training modules would require to be developed to build capacity of these organizations that will undertake such an assessment. Furthermore, a sampling algorithm would need to be developed and integrated into a program's MIS. IT infrastructure and digitization of data collection, as well as automation of data analysis, is essential so that the whole process is just made easier. And so it's easier to buy into it. As you can imagine, most state departments already have their plates too full. So as simplified the process is, the more buy-in you most likely will get. So keeping all of this in mind, we developed a 3-step framework for MGNREGS specifically, wherein the first step would then be to stratify randomly and select a sample. And this could be done by considering 10% of work category. So here, work category for under NREGA, we have about 4 work categories, many works are under them. So we would select that. And the second step would be to actually go and conduct that rapid field-based assessment using those 2 to 3 KPIs for each work, and then generalize the results to the overall state or the nation. And MGNREGS, I have to say, has a very comprehensive MIS at this point. However, they only quantify the number of assets created or the number of people that have benefited, not benefited, but have been provisioned employment. And they have this data at a very granular scale. They have it at a GP scale. You can even get household level data. And so integration of the benefits from MGNREGS work into the MIS would be a definite plus point. We also went ahead and developed a sampling algorithm. So this is essentially a crack at digitizing the process of selecting that random sample for off works to undertake the rapid field-based assessment. I'm not really going to get into it as just a visual here to like see how you could use data from an MIS to finally select the region, the beneficiary, the asset to go about conducting a field-based assessment. Now, the benefits are numerous. Essentially, in the NREGA context, it would improve the implementation of the scheme itself. And I'm pretty sure that such an assessment can improve the implementation of any scheme or program, because you would be getting feedback from beneficiaries in the field. It would generate supplementary information for social audits, which are performed under MGNREGS. So social audits here under the scheme are third-party assessment teams that go in to see whether or not works have actually been implemented when it's said that it has been implemented. Third is it would aid reporting on the relevant SDG targets, the indicators and goals, and the forestry-related NDC and adaptation communications that I mentioned earlier that India is kind of required to start doing by 2024. It would also enable reporting of carbon sequestration benefits that we need to include in our national communications and our biennial update reports that we submit to the UNFCCC. Now, the framework is fluid and adaptable and enough to be adopted by any development program. And we are looking to kind of demonstrate its utility via MGNREGS at a state level. But we went ahead and took a crack at kind of formulating the framework and applying it to any development framework. And the way I'm not really going to get into this. This is accessible online. But essentially, it says that, you know, you look at your program, you consider whether or not it has climate core benefits. If it does, then you kind of you start preparing to operationalize that framework, which then means you have to define indicators, you identify the methods to quantify those indicators, you conduct capacity building programs to ensure whoever's going to be conducting them know the methodology, and you develop the IT infrastructure that is required. In terms of prerequisites, you have to see whether or not the program has an MIS. If it does not, then you might have to create an MIS. And once you have done that, you have to develop a sampling algorithm and automate that process. Once you've done that, you kind of come to creating that sample. And when you've created that sample and you've finished conducting all of this here, where you've built capacity of people who can undertake these assessments, you go ahead and do that rapid assessment at either household level and as well as the field assessments, which are required for mitigation co-benefits. Once you've done that, you have your data, you analyze it, you generalize it, and essentially all of this has to be automated in a way that you can collect data using digital platforms. Analysis can be automated, and then you generate outputs for that sample, which can just then be generalized to different scales and integrated in, and that information should be integrated back into the MIS so that stakeholders can visualize these results, and national level bodies that are responsible for putting these kind of targets and goals in place and need to start reporting on them can access it easily and use it for their reporting requirements. In terms of barriers, we have identified that, you might see some difficulty to gain buy-in from various institutions and stakeholders that are involved in the implementation of these schemes. Like I said, their plates might be way too full to take on an additional monitoring and evaluation requirement, but that can be kind of, met by finding third-party organizations to take up such assessments. There is limited institutional capacity to carry out monitoring and reporting, and that capacity will need to be built. Furthermore, to actually operationalize the framework, as I said earlier, there's quite a lot of digitization that might be required and automation that might be required, and also integration of that information into existing MIS of schemes can be quite complex and require approvals from many respective ministries. But that is something that can be overcome, and it's not a complete no-go. But that's it from me for now. I thank you.